Time to move on to the book of Acts. We're studying about the second missionary journey in the book of Acts. We've been studying in chapter 16, and we're right at the very end of that chapter and about ready to start chapter 17. We were studying about the conversion of the jailer in his household last week, and then the order that came from the authorities for Paul and Silas to be released. So we'll take up there right after we have our opening prayer. We'll ask Brother Adam to direct our minds. Amen. All right, so I want to see Paul and Silas ordered their release, and they have to be brought out by the magistrates. We read verse 35, we read this verse last week. It says, "Now when the day came after the baptism of the jailer and all of those events of that night, and when the day came, the chief magistrate sent for the policemen, saying, 'Release those men.' And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, 'The chief magistrate has sent to release you. Now therefore, come out and go in peace.' But Paul said to them, 'They have beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans, and have thrown us into prison, and now are they sending us away secretly? No, indeed. But let them come themselves and bring us out.'" So Paul says these men need to come personally and show that this was not done right. You know, they've been in the wrong. We're not going to sneak out of town secretly after this. And the policemen reported these words to the chief magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. So they understand they're the ones now that are in trouble. If Paul takes this to the Caesar and to the authorities, that these city magistrates had treated a Roman citizen in this disgraceful way without a trial and beaten him and put him in stocks, they would have a great amount to answer for. Maybe even not just lose their jobs, maybe lose their lives for treating a Roman citizen that way. Citizen rights were a very powerful thing in the Roman Empire at that time. You know, I've heard stories about British citizenship. I remember one time in history class we were studying about some rascal that had British citizenship back in the 1800s, and he was in Athens or somewhere in Greece, and he got arrested, and they didn't think they were the British government didn't think they were treating him right, and they sent a battleship down and were going to wipe out the town if they didn't let him go. Because he's a British citizen. You don't treat him that way, right? And, you know, it kind of gets watered down over time sometimes, and it's not such a big deal. But in the early days of the Roman Empire, it was a big deal to have Roman citizenship, and the New Testament emphasizes that about Paul. It should mean a lot to be an American citizen, you'd hope. Yeah, any strike against a Roman citizen is really a strike against the government, isn't it? I mean, against the whole system. And they came and appealed to them. The magistrates come and appeal to them. And when they had brought them out, they kept begging them to leave the city. So that's quite humiliating. After they had humiliated Paul and Silas, now they come and have to beg Paul, "Please don't hold this against us. Please leave town. Let's don't have another riot." They're completely different tone and attitude after they find out what they've done. They kept begging, apologizing. The Americans, our Revised Standard Version translates it. They were hoping they wouldn't press any charges against them. It's in the present tense. They went on and on asking him to forgive them and to come out quietly and leave town. So they couldn't demand an innocent Roman citizen leave, but they might have made the argument, we don't want any more trouble, we don't want any more riots, things might get out of control. I don't know what all arguments were presented, but they seem to say you need to leave town, but we can't make you leave town. And Paul cooperates. And they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia. And when they saw the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. So they don't leave without talking to the saints there. And they get the Philippian church together. And that church is going to be one of the greatest churches in the New Testament. They're one of the most faithful. They helped Paul financially at Thessalonica 2 times, and probably at Corinth. And so, I mean, they helped him in his Roman imprisonment. They were a very faithful church, that very evangelistic. And you see this close relationship that Paul had with them. So they meet there at Lydia's house, and he's able to encourage them to persevere in the faith. No matter what opposition arises or persecution, you hang in there. And from all the record we have, they did hang in there in spite of all persecution and trial. And Paul and Silas are going to depart on down the Ignatian way, and they're going to end up at Thessalonica next. It's going to be their next place of operation. And notice here what it says, and when they saw the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. You see what happened to Luke? Luke evidently stays behind at Philippi. One of the reasons why the Philippian church is so strong is not just Paul planted the gospel there, but the preacher Luke, the great evangelist, also worked with that church when Paul left. And we don't read about Luke again until Paul comes back to that area on his third journey, and then it starts we again as he goes to Jerusalem. So evidently Luke was there for the next 7 years working with that church. And so they would be strong, wouldn't they? They had a powerful, inspired teacher that was there to continue to instruct them and ground them in the faith. Shows how important it is after somebody's baptized to study with them, teach them, that they be a part of a local church. The elders look after them and they get the studies that they need and so on to grow. That's how a church can be established and grow strong, is to not only convert people, but you teach them afterwards. And that's what we see here. So in Luke 16:40 to chapter 20 and verses 4 and 5, we don't have any we's. But after that, we'll be back with the we section again. Anybody else have a thought on the church here? Yes, absolutely. You don't have to. They don't take their revenge, do they? Or they're paying, even though they had a power over them there to really make them pay. I would wonder, what about those men's future? Did it have an influence on them, make them open to the gospel? Maybe those magistrates. It was a powerful church there later. Something
special, something different.
So it's an example of grace and mercy, and not just raw power, over somebody. Yep. All right. So chapter 17 is next on this missionary journey. Again, we're in the years 51 through 54, and he's going to go through Amphipolis and Apollonia, or just cities on the road there, and then he comes to Thessalonica. And then after that, they'll go to Berea because of persecution and establish a strong Jewish congregation there. A lot of Jews are converted in Berea. But then we're going to see some of the persecutors in Thessalonica hear that Berea had heard the word of God and accepted it, and they come over and stir up the city against Paul in Berea, and he has to leave by night, and he sails down to Athens, and he's down there by himself. And then you have that great sermon about the unknown God, and the sermon that's preached in Athens is in this chapter. All right, so let's look at his journey on the Ignatian highway there, the Roman road. Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, so those cities are, you can see Philippi on the road there. You travel down, the next city that you come to about 30 miles away is Apollonia or Amphipolis, and that's about how far, when you're really walking, putting in a good day of travel on foot, that's about how far you can go. So these cities are spaced out, kind of the distance that a person would walk to get to the next place to have an inn or to stay. And then from there, it's about another 30-something miles to Apollonia, and he's able to make that next little journey, and then about another 30 miles, he'll get over to Thessalonica. So probably 3 days of walking. That would be a good walk every day to make that. And as you look at Amphipolis, it's the capital of the eastern district of Macedonia. And then it's called, Amphipolis means around the city, because the river went around the city there. I guess is where it got its name from. And it was the 9 ways back before the Romans conquered the city, and its name was changed. A lot of roads came together there at that place. Apollonia, 30 miles further, it was, again, not, maybe, I would assume there weren't synagogues in those places, you know. He's going to the next place where he's got a good headquarters to start work among the Jews. That seems to be the custom, right, when he gets to Thessalonica. Here's again some pictures from the different archaeology books and travels of different people that have gone over to that territory, where you can see that Ignatian Way, that Roman road. Still, a lot of the cement and stones are still there. Some of the bridges with their arches have been standing there for 2,000-something years. And you think, well, Paul walked over that. That'd be something to think about. Silas, they went over that bridge on their way and traveled on. What kind of quality concrete did they have? We got these roads that like break up into pieces in no time, and they have some that have been there 2,000 years still there. And they came to Thessalonica, and there was a synagogue of the Jews. So you can see the order to the Jew first and also to the Greek was Paul's order that was given to him. So as a general practice, he would find a place where there were Jews, and there was a synagogue, and you had people that had studied their Old Testament, so he could show them, just like I did in the first sermon, from the Old Testament, that Christ was to come and be divine and rise from the dead and all of those things. And once you had that base of operation, then you could go out to the surrounding Gentiles and teach. So there was a method to what they were doing, a very effective method. So Thessalonica is a large city, the largest city in that area, and a seaport. It's the capital of the 2nd district of Macedonia in the Roman times, and a Roman province, largest city, and still today it's a giant city there today. And cities are where they're at, and it's because of where the river's at and where the port is. And there are certain things that just don't change with time that make a place like Manhattan Island in New York important no matter what century you're living in. It's going to be important. Or San Francisco Bay, that's going to be a big city forever because of what's there. And same way with Thessalonica, it is a huge city today. It's always been associated with a naval base there. The Persians, they built a naval base there when Darius came over to invade the Greeks, and you had the battle with the 300 and all of that stuff happened. His naval base was at Thessalonica. That's where it was located. So the Romans built a naval base there also, and a shipyard, a dockyard was there. So you also had that Ignatius Way, the highway. So if you plant the church in Thessalonica, it can sound forth everywhere the gospel can go. And that's the reason it's so strategically important. The next great city that you do that at is Corinth. Corinth was also like that. So Paul picks out strategic locations where he plants these early congregations, and it spread to the whole Roman world. These people there, being Jews, they were tutored, or they had a schoolmaster, the Old Testament law, to lead them to Christ. And Paul used that method in order to bring them there. Thessalonica originally was called Thermae, or Hot Springs. It was Hot Springs, Macedonia, I guess, at the time, but it got named after a daughter of Alexander the Great, who was Thessala. So they named it Thessalonica. She was married to one of those generals that took over when Alexander died and ruled over a fourth of his kingdom, was married to his sister, and he named the city, changed the name, and named it after her. It's right across the water there is Mount Olympus. So you can certainly imagine there's a lot of idolatry in this city. And you're going to read in the book of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, which you should read now since you're getting the background. It's short letters, but you get it's a mainly Gentile church, and they turned out of idolatry to serve Christ, and They're having to overcome all of those kind of things associated with paganism. They have trouble with fornication, and they also have trouble with some people not wanting to work. They're lazy. They have to deal with. So anyway, we're told in 450 B.C., Herodotus, the father of history, that as he's known, said it was a great city and a famous harbor when he wrote his book back then. Xerxes, the Persians, camped there. It was a free city. No Roman troops were quartered there. Had a popular assembly, ruled themselves, had magistrates. At the time that the Roman Empire, was beginning to divide into east and west, it was between this city and Constantinople, which one would be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. That's how important Thessalonica was. They ended up choosing Constantinople, became the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Today, I think there's 400,000 I have there in the notes that are in that place. So, large city, Thessalonica. And great place for the gospel to be settled. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures. So again, here's Paul's routine, his method of teaching people. When he got in the synagogue, they say, "Rabbi or teacher, do you have something to teach us?" He's a famous teacher. He'd get up and he'd start reading those Old Testament passages, showing them how they apply to the Christ and what the Christ was going to be like, and how he'd be a suffering servant, and he would be killed, and he'd be buried, and God would raise him from the dead. He'd be exalted up to God's right hand. And then after he'd established that, and they all saw that, then he'd drop the bomb and say, "Jesus of Nazareth, that you heard about that got crucified, he is that Christ. He is the one those passages are talking about. That was all supposed to happen. And now you should believe in him." So he reasons with them there, and a number of, there are some Jews that are converted, but many Gentiles are converted. And remember, in the synagogue in the first century, you had a lot of Gentiles that would come to the synagogue. Some of them were circumcised and became Jews, but a lot of them just accepted the Jewish religion. And those people especially hear the gospel and obey it. And that's going to stir up jealousy on the Jews that didn't obey the gospel, right? They're losing all of these potential proselytes and people they've had influence over, and now they're leaving with Paul to start a Church of Christ over here across town somewhere. And there's a lot of resentment and jealousy about that. So you can read in the book of, let's look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. Just, it's so great to be able to harmonize Acts and the letters, and get the added information from that each contribute to one another to make the picture fuller. Paul is writing to these same people we're talking about here. It says in chapter 3 of 2 Thessalonians, it says, "But the Lord is faithful, and he will strengthen and protect you from the evil one, and we have confidence in the Lord concerning you, that you are doing and will continue to do what we command. And may the Lord direct your hearts into the love of God and into the steadfastness of Christ. Now we command you, brethren, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep aloof from every brother who leads an unruly life, and not according to the traditions which you receive from us." So he deals with that laziness and people not working, thinking the Lord's coming back. "For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example, because we did not act in an undisciplined manner among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it. But with labor and hardship we kept working night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. Not because we do not have the right to this, but in order to offer ourselves as a model for you, that you might follow our example." And Paul, at the beginning of the chapter, he asked them to pray for him because there were many people hostile to him, just like the Jews had been there in Thessalonica. So he reasons with them. That's conversational exchange. They get from the Greek idea there, a teacher asking questions and them answering the questions and him showing them the verses. and reasoning with them, making his arguments about the Messiah, and comparing that life, death, and resurrection to what happened to Jesus. He was explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus who I am proclaiming to you is the Christ. So, to explain there, the Greek word means to open up, dividing or drawing asunder, to open thoroughly what had been closed. That's the Old Testament and all of those prophecies about the glorious Christ and the suffering servant, and he puts them all together and shows they both apply to Jesus. So he opens up their minds and causes them to understand with that reasoning and explaining and giving evidence to place beside or near or to set before, teaching. And here is to set forth oneself to explain and demonstrate and point out how these passages apply. And that's exactly what we should do today to convert people so that they believe for themselves based on the evidence and determine to dedicate themselves to follow Jesus. So it gives them evidence to build their life on and build their faith on. And he is a suffering Messiah, a Messiah that was of prophecy. And again, the Jews missed out on the suffering part and the death part and the burial part. They didn't see that part about the Christ. That's the reason they stumble over Jesus. But Paul explained it. He brought it out and showed it to them. In Psalm 16 and verse 10, it says he would die. His soul would not be left in Hades, nor his body suffer decay. He'd be raised from the dead. Jesus talked about the sign of Jonah. The whole book of Jonah is about Jonah being swallowed by that whale and presumed dead, as good as dead. But God heard him and brought him forth from that watery grave he was in, that whale's or fish's stomach. And that's foreshadowing Jesus and what was going to happen with him. In Isaiah 53, it tells about his death, burial, and resurrection. So we know some passages Paul would have used. They use them in the New Testament, in different books and in the book of Acts. And Paul also worked miracles while he was there. It's not mentioned here in the book of Acts, but look with me there in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 5, where Paul talks about his coming to Thessalonica. And so we get a little more detail about what went on there by putting the two together. I start in verse 5. It says, "For our gospel did not come to you in word only, but also in power and in the Holy Spirit and with full conviction, just as you know what kind of men we proved to be among you for your sake." So it wasn't just words, but there was power associated with Paul's preaching. So just like we read about in Lystra, where he saw the man and saw that he had the ability to be made well and he healed him after he'd been preaching, he must have done some things like that at Thessalonica too. That it was a regular practice of the apostles to give these divine credentials to go along with the prophecies and the message. You put those two things together, can you see why they were so powerful in converting people out of paganism and Judaism? Things that people have been in their whole life. We know how hard it is to get people out of things that they've been in their whole life and they've been dedicated to. It takes a lot of reasoning, a lot of effort to try to get them out. It'd be helpful if you could say, this is the truth, and then have a miracle to go with it, wouldn't it? And to get the church started, that power was there in the beginning to help them. So not just in word only, but also power, Paul preached in Thessalonica. Anybody else have a thought on verses 2 and 3? Paul's method there. Other than the miracle part, we need to do the same thing. Sit down in people's homes and study with them and show them these things about Christ. So they're not just believing because their parents say so, but they're believing because they know so, based on what they've learned. Verse 4, "And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a great multitude of God-fearing Greeks and a number of leading women." What do you infer from that verse there? How many Jews, how many Gentiles? He says some, and a great multitude. Well, it's a big difference, right? There's a few of the Jews in the synagogue always. Seems like everywhere he went, he got some of the Jews that were good and honest and could see what the point was and overcome their prejudice and became Christians. But here, the great multitude were Gentiles that come into this church. So when you read 1 Thessalonians, we're not surprised that that's the makeup of that church, and that's the kind of issues Paul's dealing with in 1 Thessalonians. He wrote that book shortly after he leaves town. So it's temporary, testimony about what kind of people were there and what their problems were. So he persuaded them to suffer oneself to be persuaded. They allowed themselves to be persuaded. It's in the middle mood there. It's what they did for themselves. Paul presented the evidence, and they allowed themselves to believe it, right? And that's how they break down their prejudice, and they accept the evidence. And they joined Paul and Silas. He added a sign that they threw in their lots with Paul and Silas, I guess is another way you could translate that. They became followers of Christ, and they are standing with the gospel. These God-fearing Greeks had become Christians. And they have some leading women. Some of the local authorities, their wives are members of the church. So that would be a little helpful, right? I mean, show the reach of the gospel among the classes of people in the city, that even some of the leading women have become members of the church. And Paul supports himself by working, and we read that in 2 Thessalonians there. I might read 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. He says, "For you recall, brethren, our labor and hardship, how working night and day, so as not to be a burden to any of you, we proclaim to you the gospel of God." So when Paul was there, he did not take any money from the church. He knew their background. He didn't want those people thinking he was preaching this gospel for their money. He didn't want anything from them. So he would work at a job day and night so he could preach there and make that sacrifice on their behalf, and also be an example to them about how they should work hard and take care of themselves and not depend on other people for your support. Christians work, right? We work and support ourselves and work hard enough we can help other people. That's the pattern. And in Philippians, he talks about how the Philippian church had sent him money. He also got outside support. So we hear about preachers getting outside support. That's scriptural. When a congregation sends money so an evangelist can work in some area with the church and try to build it up. In Philippians 3:16, "For even in Thessalonica we sent a gift more than once," or "you sent a gift more than once for my needs." So Paul was there long enough. So when you try to, how long was Paul in Thessalonica? He got outside support that came twice, at least, from the other place that he was in need to supplement his work that he was doing there. So he was there for a period of time, 6 months maybe, or some period of time. It was long enough they could send him support more than once from out of town to help him. And he talks about how he carried out his preaching there. Let's look at 1 Thessalonians 1, 9 and 10. It says, "For they themselves report about us what kind of a reception we had with you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve a living and true God, and to wait for His Son from heaven, whom He received from the dead, who raised from the dead, that is Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come." So when Paul got to Corinth, is where he wrote this letter from. When he gets there, the brethren there, and what happened at Thessalonica, it was something that was well known about how these Gentiles had turned and become Christians in Thessalonica and were preaching the gospel now. In chapter 2, Paul continues about how he conducted himself there. So this is all supplement to what we read in Acts. 1 Thessalonians 2:1, it says, "For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. But after we had already suffered and been mistreated in Philippi, As you know, we had the boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God amid much opposition. For our exhortation does not come from error or impurity or way of deceit, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who examines our hearts. For we never came with flattering speech, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed, God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, even though as apostles of Christ we might have asserted our authority. But we proved to be gentle among you as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. Having thus a fond affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you have become very dear to us. For you recall, brethren, that our labors and hardships, how working night and day, so as not to be a burden to any of you, we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witness, and so is God, how devotedly and uprightly and blamelessly we behaved towards you believers. Just as you know how we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you, as a father would his own children, that you may walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into His own kingdom and glory. Isn't that something? I mean, that is some great information to add on to what Luke tells us. He was there working. He acted like a father, a mother, in the way he tenderly cared for all these new converts and pleaded with them to live a Christian life. Live a life that will honor God. Leave that paganism behind and start living the way a Christian is taught to live. And he said, I didn't come there with any flattery to try to get you to follow what I'm doing. I didn't get there because it brought me anything. You know, I got beaten up in the town before. You know about that. And then he came there. I guess he still had the stripes and everything on him probably when he showed up at Thessalonica. He would have probably looked pretty rough. And he said, you know, I came there and preached. And so it wasn't out of any selfish motive that I came and preached. Right? I didn't get any money out of you when I came there. It was all for me to give to you this message. Right? That's powerful. And gives you a little, it's sort of like taking the lid off that New Testament church and letting you look inside about what was going on there and how Paul operated. Any other thoughts on Paul's work there and how he helped that church get started? All right. But with all of that good he's doing, he has opposition. Whenever the church and the gospel are very successful, the agents of opposition, they rise up. They don't let things just go on, you know, and the gospel conquer without opposition. There's going to be pushback, and that's what happens. But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. And coming upon the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them out to the people. So, same things that has happened before. It happened in Jerusalem in the beginning, right? There was a persecution against the church by the authorities there. They couldn't stop the arguments of the gospel, so they turned to force. When Paul was in Lystra, it was same thing. They stirred up the authorities against the church, and Paul had to flee on down the road to Derbe and to other places to preach. And now here it is, it happens again. There's a pattern. And they take some wicked men from the marketplace. Isn't it? I mean, every night we have things on the news and stuff about the homeless and the jobless and people hanging out downtown and don't have any good thing to do but be involved in crime or whatever. And so these politicians, these people in charge, the wealthy there, they go hire a bunch of these worthless people that are loafing around downtown to stir up a mob. Is what is pictured there. And don't we have, I use the term a lot whenever there's these political riots and stuff. Usually a lot of times they're called rent-a-mobs. You know, they can be called up at a moment's notice, it seems like. whatever the cause is they're protesting, and the same crowd shows up, and has their sign. Back then, too, nothing's changed. They get a rent-a-mob of wicked men from the marketplace, these idlers that are standing around. It's hard for people that have jobs to go out and form a mob and protest. We're all at work, right? It's the people that are, got time on their hands. They can be hired to go start a riot. And that's what happens here. Well, we'll have to come back and look at the outcome of this. They end up in Berea. And, of course, Paul will have a different reception there.